Admiral Michael Lee stood at the observation deck of the flagship, staring out into the vastness of space. The stars twinkled in the distance, but everything felt heavy. The silence of the command room was broken only by the hum of the ship's engines and the distant chatter of officers at their stations. Lee had seen peace for years, but now that peace was slipping through his fingers like sand. The Zarthani Collective had arrived, and they were unlike any enemy humanity had faced before. Their ships were sleek and deadly. Their technology advanced beyond anything humanity could even dream of. Their first strike had been swift and merciless. The outer colonies had fallen within days, and the human response had been slow. The Zarthani ships tore through defenses with ease, leaving nothing but shattered remnants of cities and mining stations. The human fleet was no match for their overwhelming firepower, and their energy shields made every human weapon seem like a toy in comparison. It was clear humanity was losing. But Lee wasn't one to accept defeat without a fight. He had spent years studying the Zarthani and their tactics. They relied heavily on their shields to protect them from conventional weapons. The traditional methods of space combat were no longer effective. The human fleet had to think differently if they were to survive. Lee paced the room, his mind racing for a solution. His gaze moved over the reports of the recent skirmishes. The same patterns emerged each time. The Zarthani would approach, launch their devastating energy blasts, and the human ships would be forced to retreat. Lee was no stranger to the weight of command. He had led his fleet through countless challenges before, but this was different. This wasn't a battle of numbers or tactics. It was a battle of technology and adaptability. Lee knew he had to outthink the Zarthani. They might have superior firepower, but humanity had something else. They had ingenuity and resourcefulness. It was in that moment that the idea hit him like a bolt of lightning. Railguns. Railguns were considered obsolete on modern warships, discarded for their lack of efficiency in the face of energy weapons. But Lee knew something that others didn't. Railguns relied on sheer kinetic force rather than energy to deal damage. And this could be humanity's saving grace. The Zarthani relied so heavily on their energy shields that they had never considered the possibility of a weapon that wasn't based on energy. Lee's mind raced as he thought of the possibilities. Railguns could pierce through shields with enough force. If re-engineered properly, they could break through the Zarthani defenses where energy weapons failed. Humanity had an advantage, and it lay in technology thought long gone. Lee stood still, a new determination settling over him. The war wasn't lost, not yet. He would need a fleet willing to trust in the new strategy, and the technology would have to be modified. But with railguns, humanity could change the course of the war. He turned to his officers, who had been watching him closely, waiting for his orders. The time for hesitation was over. They had one chance to turn the tide of the war, and he was ready to take it. The Zarthani had no idea what was coming their way. The humans were about to unveil their greatest weapon. In the quiet of his war room, Admiral Lee began to form a plan. His mind raced with possibilities as he pored over the data from the first skirmishes. He knew that humanity had lost the advantage when it came to energy weapons and shield technology. The Zarthani's advanced energy shields had proven to be nearly invulnerable to anything the human fleet had thrown at them so far. But Lee wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He needed to rethink everything he knew about warfare. Instead of fighting the Zarthani on their terms, he decided to exploit their biggest blind spot. The answer came to him as he dug deeper into human history. The railgun, a weapon once considered obsolete by modern military standards, could offer a solution. Though railguns had been overshadowed by more advanced technologies, Lee saw their potential. The basic concept of the railgun was simple. It used electromagnetic force to launch projectiles at incredible speeds, generating massive kinetic energy. Unlike energy weapons, which relied on high-powered lasers or plasma, a railgun could punch through a shield using sheer force, bypassing the need to counteract energy-based defenses. Lee knew that re-engineering a railgun to make it effective in space combat wasn't going to be easy. The technology was primitive compared to the Zarthani's. But Lee had an edge. He understood human adaptability. He knew that if anyone could make this work, it would be him and his crew. He gathered his top engineers and weapons specialists. Together, they began revising the old railgun designs. The first challenge was to make the projectiles faster and more powerful. The rails of the gun would need to be able to handle the intense electromagnetic forces required to launch a projectile at the kind of speeds that would make a dent in Zartheni shields. They worked around the clock, re-engineering everything, from the railgun barrels to the power sources, to ensure maximum efficiency. Lee also understood that a single railgun wouldn't be enough. The key to defeating the Zartheni wasn't just one powerful shot. It would be about coordination, precision, and timing. The human fleet would need to fire in unison, each ship's railgun acting as part of a larger, synchronized strike. Lee envisioned a railgun grid, where each ship's fire would create a layered barrage of projectiles that no shield could withstand. As the engineers worked tirelessly on the weapons, Lee also focused on the tactical aspect. The fleet would need to be trained to work as one cohesive unit, responding in perfect harmony to his orders. He knew the Zartheni were cunning and would adapt quickly, but with the right preparation, they could be outmaneuvered. The railguns would give humanity an edge, if they could master them in time. Weeks turned into months as Lee's fleet prepared for its next battle. The engineers completed the final modifications to the railguns, and the crew was drilled in the new tactics. The ships were ready. Now, all they needed was the right moment to strike. Admiral Lee knew that the Zartheni were not expecting this. They had underestimated humanity's ability to innovate, to take what was old and make it new. The next battle would prove that the humans were not a species to be written off. They were about to unveil their new weapon. And with it, the tide of war could finally turn in their favor. The day of the final preparations had arrived. Admiral Lee stood on the command bridge of his flagship, observing the fleet as it moved into position. Every ship was equipped with the newly re-engineered railguns, and the crew was ready to test their new weapon in real combat. The air was thick with anticipation. It had taken months of hard work, sleepless nights, and countless adjustments to get to this point. Lee knew that the next few hours could make or break humanity's fight for survival. Lee had gathered his fleet from various parts of the human colonies. Some ships were old and heavily modified, while others were new cutting-edge designs. Despite the differences in age and make, all of them had been fitted with the same railgun system. Each ship now held the potential to turn the tide of the war. But that was the easy part. The real challenge lay in the crew's ability to use these weapons effectively. Railguns weren't like traditional energy weapons. They required precision, coordination, and timing. Lee had spent countless hours training his crew, pushing them to their limits. The key was synchronization. Each ship would have to fire in perfect unison. One mistake could mean the failure of the entire strike. The officers and gunners had been trained to react at a moment's notice, to execute their orders with military precision. Lee had no room for error. As the fleet moved closer to the Zartheni position, Lee gathered his officers in the briefing room. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of command. "Today, we use what we've built. The railguns will be our primary weapons. We'll strike in waves, one ship after another. Each salvo will build on the last. If we do this right, we can overwhelm their shields and pierce their hulls. But it will require perfect timing." He paused, allowing his officers to absorb the gravity of his words. The officers nodded in understanding. Lee knew that this was not just a test of firepower, it was a test of resolve. The Zartheni were formidable, but they had never faced anything like this before. The fleet was now within range of the enemy. Lee took his seat in the command chair, his eyes scanning the holographic display. On the screen, the Zartheni ships loomed large, their sleek forms gliding through space with a terrifying sense of purpose. They were prepared for battle, but they weren't expecting the humans to fight back with such a weapon. "All ships, initiate railgun grid," Lee ordered, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. The fleet responded almost instantly. The hum of the railguns charging filled the command bridge. Lee watched as the ships aligned their positions, preparing for the synchronized strike. Then, with a single command, the first shot was fired. The railgun projectiles shot through space with terrifying speed, streaking toward the Zarthani ships. The impact was immediate. The first few shots hit the Zarthani shields, causing them to shimmer and crack under the intense kinetic force. The Zarthani had never experienced such an assault. Their shields began to buckle, and several ships were forced to divert their energy to reinforce their defenses. But the human fleet was relentless. Each ship fired in turn, creating a continuous barrage of projectiles that pummeled the Zarthani defenses. Lee's fleet moved as one, each ship contributing to the overwhelming assault. The Zarthani were caught off guard, unable to react quickly enough to the coordinated strike. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, the humans were on the offensive. The Zarthani had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt and innovate. Lee's railgun strategy had given the human fleet an unexpected edge. Now, it was only a matter of time before the tide of war would shift in their favor. The battle had only just begun, but already the results were promising. Admiral Lee watched as his fleet continued to rain down railgun fire on the Zarthani ships. The synchronized barrage was like nothing the enemy had faced before. Their shields were holding for now, but the sheer force of the human strike was beginning to take its toll. Lee could see the flickering signs of weakening defenses, and he knew this was the moment they needed to press forward. The Zarthani had begun to retaliate. Their energy weapons were powerful, and they fired with deadly precision, tearing through the human ships in ways Lee had seen all too often before. But now, the tables had turned. The railgun fire was relentless, and the Zarthani shields, once thought invincible, were beginning to show signs of strain. Lee's fleet kept their distance, firing in waves, always keeping the pressure on the enemy. "Keep the pressure on them," Lee ordered. "We need to break through their defenses now." The fleet responded instantly, firing another wave of railgun shots in perfect harmony. Lee's eyes were glued to the screen, watching as the projectiles tore into the Zarthani ships. He could see the first of their smaller vessels beginning to disintegrate under the onslaught. The soundless explosions were a testament to the power of the human strategy. The Zarthani ships were losing more and more ground as the railgun fire continued to build up. A massive Zarthani battleship emerged from the chaos, its shields flaring as it took the full force of a railgun strike. But even its mighty defenses couldn't withstand the combined power of the fleet. The ship buckled, its hull cracked under the force of the impact, and with a final tremor, it exploded into a cloud of debris. "Direct hit," one of the officers on the bridge whispered in awe. There was a pause, followed by a burst of cheers from the crew. But Lee remained focused. This battle was far from over. The Zarthani quickly adapted, pulling back and regrouping. They were not foolish enough to underestimate the humans again. Lee knew the Zarthani would learn from this, and soon they would change their tactics. But for now, they were on the back foot. The battle continued to rage, but the human fleet was gaining ground. Each wave of railgun fire brought them closer to victory. The Zarthani had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt and innovate, but now they were beginning to realize their mistake. As the Zarthani ships began to retreat, Lee felt a surge of triumph. They had won their first real victory. The human fleet had struck back with a force the Zarthani hadn't expected, and they were already retreating. But Lee knew this was just the beginning. This was only the first victory in what would be a long and bloody war. "Prepare for the next wave," Lee commanded, his voice steady. "We're not finished yet." The battle wasn't over. The Zarthani may have retreated for now, but Lee was determined to keep pushing forward. This was only the first step in humanity's fight for survival, and they were just getting started. The victory was short-lived. As the human fleet regrouped and prepared for what they believed would be their next offensive, the Zarthani were already planning their retaliation. The human forces had made a significant dent in the Zarthani armada, But Lee knew better than to think that would stop them. The Zarthani were a cunning and resourceful species. They would learn from their mistakes, adapt quickly, and strike back with even more force. Admiral Lee stood at the command center, analyzing the data coming in from the fleet sensors. The Zarthani were not retreating in defeat. They were repositioning. Lee's strategy had caught them off guard, but they were regrouping, and he had no illusions about how quickly they would adjust. He knew they had just a brief window of opportunity before the Zarthani unleashed their next counterattack. "Keep all systems at maximum readiness," Lee ordered. "We've struck a blow, but now we wait for the enemy to adapt." His officers worked swiftly, sending out new orders to the fleet. They had to remain alert, as the Zarthani had proven themselves capable of shifting tactics at a moment's notice. The human fleet's railguns had caused significant damage, but they needed to continue applying pressure, not allowing the Zarthani to recover fully. The Zarthani counterstrike came sooner than expected. Lee had anticipated a delay, but the Zarthani had already begun to modify their tactics. They had learned quickly from their earlier encounter, and now they were using a different approach. A wave of smaller, faster ships shot out from the Zarthani fleet, darting through the debris fields and engaging in aggressive hit-and-run tactics. These ships were designed to avoid direct hits from the railguns while striking from unexpected angles. The human fleet responded in kind, trying to maintain formation and fire in synchronized waves, but the smaller Zarthani vessels were proving difficult to track. They darted in and out of range with surprising agility, using the debris fields as cover. Lee watched the holographic battlefield unfold before him, trying to anticipate the Zarthani's next move. "Deploy the interceptors," Lee ordered, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't about to let the Zarthani take control of the field. The railguns had worked before, but the speed of the smaller vessels was a challenge. The interceptors, equipped with guided missiles, would give the human fleet a chance to keep up with the Zarthani's movements and prevent them from causing too much damage. But the Zarthani weren't finished with their surprises. Lee's sensors picked up a new signal. Something large was coming their way. A massive Zarthani warship, much larger than the one they had destroyed earlier, was emerging from the shadows of the asteroid belt. This new ship had been carefully hidden, waiting for the right moment to strike. Lee's heart sank. The ship was a beast, its hull reinforced, and its energy shields clearly designed to withstand far more than any of the human fleet's current firepower could deliver. "Target the new ship," Lee said, his voice steady but urgent. "Focus all railgun fire on that vessel. We need to take it down before it reaches our perimeter." The human fleet responded quickly. The railguns charged once more, and a series of projectiles were launched toward the massive Zarthani warship. The ship's shields flared as the projectiles impacted, but the shield was holding. The Zarthani were clearly confident in their new ship's defenses. The human fleet's fire was strong, but it wasn't enough. Lee watched as the Zarthani warship fired back, its energy weapons cutting through space with terrifying precision. One of the human ships in the outer ring was struck and exploded into a cloud of debris. It was a devastating loss, and Lee's mind raced. The Zarthani had adapted quickly, but Lee wasn't going to give up. This war had just entered a new phase. It was no longer about one battle. It was about survival. And for humanity to survive, they had to keep adapting just as fast as the enemy. Admiral Lee stood at the center of the command bridge, his hands clenched behind his back. The situation had escalated quickly. The massive Zarthani warship, which had seemed unstoppable moments ago, was now the center of the human fleet's attention. They couldn't afford to let it break through their lines. If that ship reached their core fleet, it could deal irreparable damage. Lee had no choice but to risk everything. "Prepare all remaining railguns," Lee ordered, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of command. "This is our last chance. Focus all fire on that warship." The crew jumped to action, readying the powerful weapons. The human fleet had taken a few hard hits, and the number of fully operational ships was dwindling. But they had one advantage the Zarthani didn't. The railgun fire, relentless and precise, was still capable of piercing the toughest shields. If they concentrated their fire, they could overwhelm even the Zarthani's newest ship. The massive Zarthani vessel loomed closer, its sleek design contrasting with the chaos of the battlefield. It seemed almost invulnerable, but Lee could see the cracks forming in its shield. Every railgun shot made its mark, each strike weakening its defenses. He had been through battles before, but this one felt different. There was something about the calmness with which the Zarthani had adjusted that unnerved him. They were too intelligent. They had been prepared for this fight in ways Lee hadn't anticipated. "Status on the interceptors?" Lee asked, his eyes narrowing as the Zarthani warship drew nearer. "The interceptors are holding off the smaller ships," Admiral, his tactical officer, responded. "But the main threat is still closing in. We've lost contact with 3 of our support ships." Lee's gaze flicked to the damage reports. The Zarthani had underestimated human resilience. Despite the losses, the fleet had maintained its cohesion. Now it was time to push forward. "Activate the final salvo," Lee said, his voice firm. "We push them back now, or we lose this entire fleet." The final wave of railgun fire surged forward. Every human ship in the fleet fired together, a storm of projectiles hurling toward the enemy warship. For a moment, there was a breathless silence as the projectiles crossed the distance. Then the impact came. The Zarthani shields flared, flickering under the intensity of the combined strike. The Zarthani ship shook violently. Lee could see the warship's hull begin to buckle under the pressure. The Zarthani had underestimated the human resolve. The synchronized fire, the sheer volume of impact from the railguns, was overwhelming. With a final, explosive series of impacts, the Zarthani warship's shields failed. The ship was exposed. "Direct hit," the officer at the weapons station shouted. "They're losing power." The moment the shields fell, the human fleet did not hesitate. Another series of railgun blasts followed, this time aimed at the core of the ship. The Zarthani vessel trembled again, and then, finally, it erupted in a massive explosion. The shockwave rocked the human fleet, but the sight of the Zarthani warship being torn apart was a hard-earned victory. For a brief moment, the command bridge erupted in cheers. The crew, exhausted but triumphant, felt the weight of their efforts lift. The Zarthani flagship was gone, but Admiral Lee knew this was not the end of the fight. The Zarthani fleet had been badly damaged, but they still had other ships, and they still had the ability to regroup. Lee turned to his second-in-command. "We've dealt them a severe blow, but this war isn't over. We need to move quickly, reinforce the perimeter, and prepare for the next wave." This was just one battle in a long war. The second-in-command nodded. "Yes, sir. We've given them a lot to think about." Lee walked to the edge of the command bridge and stared out into space. The battle had turned in their favor, but the Zarthani were not finished. He had no illusions about that. They had to remain vigilant. This victory was important, but it was just a step. The war was far from won. They would need more than just ingenuity and railguns to win. They would need unity, resolve, and the will to keep fighting no matter how difficult it became. He turned back to the crew, his face resolute. "Prepare for the next phase. The Zarthani will not let us rest. We move forward together." The human fleet had tasted victory, but Admiral Lee knew the Zarthani were not the type to retreat permanently. The remnants of their fleet had scattered, but they were regrouping. Lee could feel the tension building in the command bridge. The fleet had been through one fierce battle, but the Zarthani would soon strike back with everything they had left. Lee stood before the holographic display of the battlefield, his mind working furiously. The Zarthani were a relentless enemy, and now they had seen the effectiveness of the human railguns. They would adapt again, just as they always did. The question was how soon, and how hard they would come at them. "Admiral," his tactical officer said, drawing him from his thoughts, "we've detected a large Zarthani fleet moving into position. They're about to make their counterattack. It looks like they're massing all remaining forces at the edge of the system. Lee's heart sank. The Zarthani were pulling no punches. If they were throwing everything they had left into this final push, it meant they had a strategy in mind. They had underestimated humanity's ability to innovate, but now they would be determined to crush the human fleet. The question was whether the railguns would be enough to hold them off. "Deploy all ships to intercept," Lee ordered. "We need to hold the line." The crew scrambled to prepare. They had already sustained losses, but they couldn't afford to falter. Every ship counted now. The railguns would be their primary weapon, but Lee knew that they had to adapt their strategy to outmaneuver the Zarthani. As the human fleet moved into position, Lee gathered his senior officers. "This will be our most difficult battle yet. The Zarthani will test everything we've built, and they will push us to our limits. But we have something they don't. We have determination, ingenuity, and a resolve to fight for our future. Do not underestimate them, but do not let fear take hold either. We will face this challenge head-on." The officers nodded in agreement. The room was filled with quiet resolve. They were ready. Humanity had come this far not because they were the strongest, but because they were willing to fight when no one else would. The Zarthani fleet arrived in full force. They had learned from their previous encounter and were using a new formation. Unlike the scattered, unpredictable movements from before, the Zarthani now moved as one, their ships tightly clustered. They were focused on overwhelming the human fleet with sheer firepower and force. "All ships, maintain formation," Lee barked. "Do not break ranks. Stay in sync. The Zarthani want to divide us. We hold together, or we fall apart." The human fleet engaged. The railguns fired in coordinated blasts, tearing into the first wave of Zarthani ships. For a brief moment, it seemed like the human fleet might push them back again. But the Zarthani weren't giving up so easily. Their smaller, agile ships darted in and out of the human line, firing deadly energy blasts that decimated human defenses. "Report," Lee demanded, his eyes fixed on the battlefield. "We've lost 2 more ships," Admiral, the tactical officer, reported grimly. "Their smaller ships are more agile than we anticipated. We're having difficulty tracking them." Lee's mind raced. He needed to think of something new, something that would allow his fleet to outmaneuver the Zarthani. The railguns were still their best weapon, but they needed to use their range advantage more effectively. "Order all ships to spread out," Lee said after a brief pause. "We can't let them surround us. Focus on the larger Zarthani vessels with everything we've got. Their shields may be stronger, but the more we hit them, the more their defense will crack." The human ships reformed, spreading out to create a larger perimeter. Railguns continued to fire, but now the human fleet was more mobile, each ship positioning itself for better shots at the larger Zarthani targets. The smaller Zarthani ships, while dangerous, were harder to hit now that the humans weren't stationary. "Now focus fire," Lee ordered. "We bring down their flagship first. If we can break the head, the body will fall." Every ship in the human fleet aimed its fire at the Zarthani flagship. The railguns charged up, one after another, as the human ships coordinated their shots. The Zarthani flagship began to falter under the intensity of the assault. The shields flickered and failed, and with a series of violent impacts, the flagship's hull cracked. It wasn't enough to destroy the ship, but it was a start. Lee knew that the Zarthani were no longer in control. Their flagship was in trouble, and that would demoralize them. The Zarthani had thrown their best at the humans, and it was starting to unravel. "Keep pushing," Lee shouted. "We are not done yet." The battle had reached its climax. The human fleet had fought with everything they had, but the Zarthani were proving just how relentless they could be. Despite the significant damage to their flagship and the growing chaos within their forces, the Zarthani were not backing down. They had one last gambit, and it was unlike anything the humans had seen before. Admiral Lee stood on the command bridge, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The human fleet had suffered losses. Several ships were severely damaged, and some were no longer in fighting condition. But they were still holding their ground. They were pushing back. Lee could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him. This was the moment of truth. The Zartheni had brought their best, and now humanity would have to give everything they had left. "Status report," Lee asked, his voice calm but firm. He needed to know exactly where they stood. "We've lost 3 more ships, Admiral," his tactical officer replied, her voice strained. "But their flagship is nearly destroyed. They're pulling back, trying to regroup. It's a desperate attempt." Lee's mind raced. The Zartheni were resilient, but they were clearly running out of options. The flagship was on the brink of collapse, and their remaining forces were fragmented. This was the final opportunity to strike the killing blow. "Focus all fire on their flagship," Lee ordered, a hard edge to his voice. "We finish this now." The human fleet responded instantly. Railguns charged and fired, their powerful shots tearing into the heart of the Zartheni flagship. The Zartheni attempted to reroute their energy shields, but it was too late. With each strike, the flagship's integrity weakened, its systems failing one by one. The once mighty ship that had seemed so invulnerable now trembled under the relentless barrage. On the bridge, Lee watched the display in silence. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the end of a long and bitter struggle. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins as the final shots hit the flagship. It was a direct hit. The ship's core exploded in a violent, blinding flash, sending shockwaves through space. The Zartheni fleet faltered. Their flagship was gone, and with it, their confidence. The remaining ships scattered in disarray, retreating into the darkness of space. The human fleet had achieved the impossible. They had broken the Zartheni's will to fight. "Admiral, the Zartheni are retreating," the tactical officer said, her voice filled with disbelief. "They've pulled back. We've won." For a moment, there was silence on the command bridge. The crew stared at the display, unable to believe it. The Zartheni, who had once seemed so powerful, were now fleeing. The human fleet had won. Lee felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly tempered by the reality of the cost. The victory was hard-earned, and there were many fallen comrades. The price of this battle had been high, but the Zartheni threat was finally broken. They had survived. "Prepare to signal the rest of the fleet," Lee said, his voice steady. "We've won, but there's still much to be done. This war isn't over. We need to regroup and prepare for any further action." He turned to face his officers, his face somber but proud. "Today, we've proven something. The Zartheni thought they could crush us, but we fought back. We may have lost ships and lives, but we never lost our will to survive. This victory is just the beginning. We've shown the galaxy that humanity will never surrender. We will always rise, no matter the odds." As the fleet began to stabilize and the damage reports came in, Lee knew that the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a moment of pride. Humanity had made it through the darkness. They had won.